All right, live pictures right now out of Boston. You've got conflicting marches taking place and organized gatherings taking place. You've got marchers going through the streets of Boston, many of whom are there in solidarity, who claim they're there to counter-protest a gathering that is scheduled right in the center of Boston by a group called the Boston Free Speech Coalition, a coalition that describes itself as that of libertarians, progressives, conservatives, and independents. This is expected to be quite the gathering of a number of people. Police are out in full force, and they're also looking through bags and looking on persons to make sure there are no weapons. But again, we continue to monitor the events there unfolding with, as you see there in the center of town, a gathering of one group of people. And then you saw the other live pictures of a group of people who are marching through the streets of Boston. So we've also seen, while all of this is taking place as a backdrop, quite the dramatic turnover of President Trump's inner circle during his short 7 months in office. Take a look at this Oval Office photograph. National Security Advisor Michael Flynn fired in February, gone. White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer resigning in July, gone. Reince Priebus was fired a short time later. And then finally yesterday, Chief Strategist Steve Bannon was also let go, leaving now the president and the vice president there in the Oval Office. So let's discuss this and more with our panel. Of course, there are other staffers, but it's just that photograph, which is quite profound. Selena Zito is a CNN contributor and a reporter for the Washington Examiner. Joining us, Larry Sabato, the director for the Center for Politics at the University of Virginia. Stephen Collinson is a CNN politics senior reporter. And Tanzina Vega is CNN's national reporter for race and inequality. Good to see all of you as we also continue to look at the live pictures out of Boston with a number of marchers and demonstrators all culminating there on this Saturday. All right, good to see all of you. Selena, let me begin with you, and because you do have your finger on the pulse of many Trump supporters. Are Trump supporters concerned at all with this rapid turnover, with the many distractions going on in the White House?
Well, I mean, one of the things we have to remember about Trump voters is that they bought into this guy's personality, meaning President Trump, his personality long before he ran for president. So they knew he was disruptive. They knew that he could change things on a dime. And so they sort of understood that when they voted for, as part of the equation in voting for him. Mm-hmm. So they also understood, because there's several things going on here, they also understood that this was not, at the time that he was elected, a polished politician. So that his decisions and who he puts in office may or may not work. We have seen what doesn't work. Flynn under fire for all kinds of suspicions and allegations of misconduct. Reince Priebus did not turn out to be, although he was very effective in the picking of the cabinet, he did not turn out to be quite the liaison that the president needed with the House and the Senate on Capitol Hill, something that is incredibly important. And Steve Bannon, you have to remember when I interview people across the Rust Belt, which was very impactful in putting him in the office, they had no idea who Steve Bannon was. So they weren't emotionally attached to him. And remember, these are voters in Wisconsin and Michigan and Iowa and Indiana and Pennsylvania and Ohio who made the difference. So I don't think they're upset that he's gone if you're looking at those specific types of voters.
All right. So, Larry, the president certainly has received a lot of criticism in the past week, particularly because of his response and lack thereof from about Charlottesville, exactly where you are as a University of Virginia professor there, in a place that you call home. He blamed, meaning the president blamed both sides. Then he criticized the removal of the Confederate monuments as foolish. But listen to what candidate Trump said about the Confederate flag back in 2015.
I think it's time to take down the flag, put it in a museum. It represented a time and a place, but I would say taking down the flag would be a positive thing.
So then, Larry, how has that message and the messages resonated there from your standpoint?
Well, first, Fred, I'm glad you showed that clip because, as we all know, on 1,000 subjects, Donald Trump is, and will flip-flop. What he says one day doesn't have any relationship to the next day. He does what is in his political interests. I suppose that's the one thing he has in common with professional politicians. But as far as the way we look at it here, we regard President Trump as a big piece of the problem we saw unfold before us. The president, during his campaign, emboldened and energized the very people that probably will be in Boston today and certainly were here in droves last weekend. And he made the problem worse with the things that he said and did over the last week. Whether it affects his base, we've talked about this a million times. Most of them will stick with him regardless of what he does. But, everybody else comprises a large majority, Fred. And that large majority increasingly is anti-Trump.
And Larry, while you're talking, I mean, these are an astounding representation of people there marching through the streets of Boston right now. We understand that there are a couple of different gatherings, at least a couple. There's one central gathering by this group saying that they are gathering in the name of free speech. They call them the New Free Speech Movement or the Boston Free Speech Coalition. And then you have a number of people, presumably these, that are marching through the streets of Boston to meet up with or get close enough to the location where the gathering of the Free Speech Coalition will take place. No one or police have put protections in place to try to keep any violence from happening. So, Stephen, as we look at these images, and we know what was central to the unrest in Charlottesville, Virginia, and how the president handled it within the White House, his advisors, his flesh and blood, his daughter, Ivanka, has been pretty quiet. The son-in-law, Jared Kushner, have been very quiet. What's your view about what's happening within that family, within the White House, as it tries to handle this?
Well, I think you've got a couple of things going on in the White House at the moment. You have John Kelly, the chief of staff, who is trying to put together a much more organized structure, sophisticated messaging so that everybody is on the same page, and to try to end these factions that have existed in the White House. You have the sort of Jared Kushner, Ivanka Trump faction, you had the Steve Bannon faction, you had a faction around Reince Priebus, to try and get everybody on the same page. And that's good as far as it goes. You're right, it's been striking that there has been no statement or tweets really from Ivanka Trump or Jared Kushner on the president's remarks at that wild press conference on Tuesday. But I think it just goes to show that you can put together a much more organized and conventional White House structure and policy operation, and you can let disruptive forces like Stephen Bannon leave. But the most disruptive force, the most unpredictable force, the most undisciplined and ungovernable force is still the president himself, and he can come out at any time and say exactly what he wants. I think the key image of this week was at that press conference when the president talked about Charlottesville, and John Kelly was pictured just sort of looking at his shoes. I mean, he can control a lot of the things inside the West Wing, but he can't control the president himself. So
reportedly, Ivanka and Jared were not in favor of, keeping a Steve Bannon. They've been pushing for him reportedly to leave. Do you believe that this last shove was inspired largely by Jared and Ivanka?
It's been interesting because over the last 2 weeks, which you could argue are perhaps the most disastrous 2 weeks so far in the Trump presidency, Jared Kushner, Ivanka Trump were out of the picture. They were up in Vermont for some of that time. They were at Bedminster as well with the president. So if they are organizing things behind the scenes, it's very behind the scenes. It's interesting that they would come out once this has been sort of put together, the ouster of Bannon, and sort of leak that they were involved in it. Whether that's the case or whether they're trying to put the best face on this, it's unclear. But there are clearly worries among people in the sort of Bannon wing of the Trump coalition, in the media at least, that the departure of Steve Bannon will lead to more power and influence to what they see as much more moderate, even democratic influences by people like Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner on the president.
Tanzina, as we look at these pictures out of Boston, we really are seeing quite the tapestry of images from the throngs, what appear to be hundreds of people marching through the streets of Boston. You see some tight shots where in Harmony people are walking with signs. You see some other tight shots that we've gone, back and forth with people who have masked their faces, who are, standing. They're holding signs too. We can't see the front of the signs to see what they're saying, nor are we able to hear the audio. But what's your concern or hope as it pertains to the gatherings taking place here a week away from what took place in Charlottesville, Virginia, with the president continuing his vacation in New Jersey, and the importance of him saying something or in some way conveying a message as this unfolds?
This week, and I was saying this earlier this week, these events in Charlottesville and beyond have really ripped the Band-Aid off of race relations in America. We are seeing what I think a lot of communities of color have seen for decades, the pain, the ugliness, and the unfortunate rhetoric and violence that can go along with our race relations in America. And I think, there's been sort of a reluctance to assume. I mean, think about it. Just a couple of years ago, we were talking, the media and other folks were talking about how President Obama's, presidency represented a post-racial America. And so that obviously was not true. And so we have to reckon with our history. And I think that's what we're seeing now with these debates, with these marches, with these debates around taking down Confederate statues and other Confederate monuments. I think, what we're seeing here is both the best of America, which allows for us to get out and say what we want to say. And if we can protest peacefully, that's something that is it is our right in this country to do that. What we're also seeing is a very ugly and unfinished history that has to be reconciled with, we have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable about having these conversations. And frankly, it's taken an unfortunate turn of events for us to be able to really have a conversation about where we are today, in America when it comes to race and our policies.
Again, on the ground there in Boston, you see thousands of people who have turned out for demonstrations and rallies. Right there in Boston, people walking through the streets there. My producer telling me they were able to hear some of the chanting from people saying stand up and fight back. We continue to watch the developments there in Boston, now 1 week away from what took place in Charlottesville, Virginia. We will keep close tabs on developments there. So much more straight ahead in the newsroom. Thanks to our panel there. We'll leave you now with more pictures out of Boston.